Rocky Marciano. Tough as a rock. He was very well named. He would wear you down. It was like going up against granite.
On offense, he never gave you the ball. He was one of those great competitors.
He was relentless. The bell would ring, he would be on you. The bell ring, he'd stop. The bell would ring, he would be right back on you.
Marciano could take anything. If a building fell on him, he'd be swinging.
He would be the physical metaphor for the irresistible force. He just kept coming and throwing that dreadful overhand right that just hammered everybody into submission.
He was just a hard hitter, slam bam, didn't give a damn.
Anybody gets hit on the jaw, flush, by Marciano goes. They just go.
Marciano trained like an old-time bare-knuckle fighter. He had the endurance to go 20 rounds. He could knock you out in the 20th round.
He had to train. He had to be in better shape than his opponent, otherwise he wasn't going to win, and he knew that. Based on just skill and natural speed and strength, he wasn't going to beat the top heavyweights. So he had to work that hard.
He always did this with his wrist. He said, what are you doing? He said, exercise the wrist. And then he'd look up at the heaven. He says, Nitch, I'm going to be champ someday. I'm going to be champ of the world.
With that thought burned into his psyche, Marciano, in the summer of 1952, withdrew to his lair in New York's Catskill Mountains and prepared for battle with a Spartan's severity.
He used to train up in Grossinger's in the airplane hangar, and he'd stay there for 2 months before a fight. He loved training. He loved training.
Rocky was like a hermit, like a Trappist monk. He wouldn't go down to the big glitzy hotel down below where all the stars were on stage every night.
He denied his body all of the things that he loved in life.
He didn't have sex. He didn't have anything. Someone had told him sex would take something out of you, take some of your power away.
Not only was there no intimate relations with his wife, there was no contact with his wife for the 2 weeks before the fight.
At training camp, there was always a little rubber ball there, and Rocky would start playing with his ball, start hitting it, and just for his reactions and his quickness.
He focused upon his opponent with a kind of monomaniacal ferocity that his opponent was the person he was thinking of constantly for weeks and weeks and weeks.
On September 23rd in Philadelphia, a lean, hard, hungry Marciano stepped into the ring and stared obsessively into the opposite corner. What he saw was not a man, but an obstacle to be destroyed.
I bet $1,000 on him, and those days that was a lot of money. One of my friends put his house up.
Here they go.
Walcott had gone in against Marciano as the underdog, and yet he fought like the favorite.
Marciano staggered with a sharp right.
And the two of them came out making moves, and all of a sudden Walcott threw that hook, and down went Rocky on his hands and knees.
Down from a left hook.
He got knocked down for the first time in his career, and I thought the world had ended.
A lot of fighters, when they get knocked down and cut the first time, fall apart emotionally. Marciano got tougher when he got knocked down.
You saw him single-mindedly keep going in, kept going in, kept trying his strike.
Rocky would throw a good combination. Walcott would come right back with 2 left hooks and a right cross. It was a very bloody fight.
Marciano is now cut on the forehead.
For 4 rounds, a solvent got into his eye. He was blinded. He couldn't see.
Because I was talking to Rocky after the fight, and I says, could you see the guy at all, Rock? He says, Snap, for 3 or 4 rounds, all I could see was a shadow.
I was sitting with a priest right at ringside, a friend of Rocky's, and this priest kept saying, Pete, just keep praying, have faith, he'll come back.
Back in Brockton, Massachusetts, a woman knelt alone in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church. Pasqualina Marciano refused to watch her son in the ring, yet each time he fought, she prayed to the Virgin Mary.
In the 12th round, Walcott, who was a superb heavyweight, gave Marciano such a beating that didn't think Rocky would be able to come out for the 13th round.
I had it 8-4 in Walcott's favor.
Marciano was behind on all three scorecards. He maneuvered Walcott to the ropes in the 13th round.
I was hollering, Lollapalooza, Rock, Lollapalooza, and then all of a sudden, bang. Walcott got hit with a sledgehammer. He might still be lying there for all I know.
He fell flat in his face, thought it killed him. People in the audience were just amazed, didn't move a muscle.
Greatest single punch I ever remember. Walcott went down, and I think hours later he was still out.
And the new heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Marciano!
Well, last night I fought a real true champion in Jersey Joe Walcott. He proved to me what a champion is made out of. And I only hope that I could be as good as him.
Walking up the sidewalk in Philly. Police officer, Italian, went crazy, grabbed Rocky. He was crying, too. He made a signal. Another cop, 150 yards up, he picked it up. Another Italian. He grabbed Rocky, hugging and kissing.
What people loved about Marciano is what they love about most athletes. How he was willing to walk through the fire to get to his goal.
He didn't have the style of a ballerina, but he won.
Marciano was very much of the 50s. He took a good deal of punishment of a kind that we don't see boxers taking mostly today.
The fiercest, most determined, and relentless fighter that ever lived. He was a fighter that had no concept of losing.
He was a fighter who gave you every ounce of energy he had, every split second he was in the ring.
Undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Marciano!
Marciano was the biggest thing in Brockton's history.
Every time his car went down Main Street in Brockton, it would be stopped by the crowds of people that came around.
Tens and tens of thousands. Going down Pleasant Street, Brockton, going down Main Street, Brockton, down Brook Street to Eggers Playground.
And the kids just clamored to get near him, to touch him. They'd have their little cards that they wanted him to sign, and he seemed at times to be overwhelmed by the adulation that was given him. I mean, after all, he was just a poor kid.
Yes, sir, and no, sir kind of a guy, and very mild-mannered. If you met him and you didn't know that he was a heavyweight champion of the world, you would never guess that he was a prize fighter.
There was nothing glitzy about Rocky Marciano. At least in terms of image, he wasn't larger than life, as the heavyweight champion of the world has been so many times, and according to the American public, is supposed to be.
The sports writers would ask him, Rocky, what round are you going to knock him out? He always said this, I hope to win. He never mentioned anything about a knockout, what round.
He believed in getting things done and doing them and not going around bragging about it. He didn't brag about himself.
He didn't make himself out to be a hero. You know, just a hard worker. Grew up that way.
Born September 1st, 1923, Marciano grew up in an environment that was blue-collar, head to toe.
Brockton was known as the shoe city. They produced the largest amount of shoes of any place in the country. Dad worked in a shoe shop. He worked on a machine called a number 5 machine. And in the summertime, it would be a sweat box. It would be horrible.
He'd come home smelling of shoe leather, and Rocky never wanted to be in that. And his father always told him not to.
Dad was a dominating person, but my mom was a little bit louder.
Oh, she was the boss all the way. She would holler at him, and he would pay attention, too.
My mother didn't want any part of boxing. She used to tell Rocky, why don't you get into music? Or why don't you become a dancer? And, of course, Rocky would look at her and laugh and say, Mom, I can't sing and I can't dance.
He thought his future was going to be in sports. No, he didn't think it was going to be in boxing. All his life, he idolized baseball players.
He played for a parochial team, St. Patrick's, and Father Jeremiah Minahan was the boss. He says, Rocco, why don't you give somebody else a break? Chief Father, he says, I have to get my wax. And he's been up there at least an hour.
And he would just stay in that playground, and they would pitch to him all day long.
His greatest hero was Joe DiMaggio. And of course, he loved Ted Williams. He always wanted to follow their footsteps and become a great baseball player.
He just loved athletics. He was always known as the toughest guy. You just never messed with Rocky Marciano.
One guy owed Rocky some money, and Rocky went up and broke his jaw. Tipped him upside down, took whatever he had.
Rocky quit high school at 16 and worked as a laborer until he was drafted into the Army in 1943. After the war, his big league dreams ended when he failed to try out with the Cubs. Marciano then heeded the advice of his childhood friend and running mate, Allie Colombo.
Many times, Allie and Rocky would come down our street. They ran tremendously long distances. And I often looked at Rocky's sneakers. They were worn so almost threadbare.
They decided that they were going to embark on a professional boxing career. They were going to look for a manager.
After driving to New York City in the spring of 1948, Rocky and Allie hoped to convince noted promoter and matchmaker Al Weil to jumpstart Marciano's career.
Al Weil could really move a fighter if the fighter was good.
Of course, Al Weil, at that time, said, "What do you have to offer?"
Up until then, he was a rough and ready puncher, and his style hadn't been given the finesse that was needed for a real boxing champion.
He was just over 5'10". He was maybe about 185 pounds. He had a 67-inch reach. This was amazingly short for a heavyweight.
The critics were saying, he hasn't got it. He hasn't got it. He's too clumsy.
Well, the only other person I knew that was that clumsy when he started out, and forever for that matter, was Rocky Graziano. Both of them, their footwork was terrible.
2 left feet, stoop-shouldered and balding, and God, he could punch.
And he could take a punch, and in the heavyweight division, that might take you the whole way.
Weil agreed to arrange some fights for Marciano in Providence, but first he insisted that Rocky take a lesson or two in this sweet science.
Rocky was so raw at the start that his trainer, Charlie Goldman, did a legendary thing, actually tied string to Rocky's feet so that Rocky could keep his balance. This was a guy who didn't even know the most basic footwork.
Goldman did teach Marciano a lot in a short period of time about shortening up his punches, being able to punch with both hands, not just his right.
When he turned pro under the direction of Al Weil, he was almost 25 years of age. That, for a fighter at that time, was ancient. He had every strike against him, except a willingness to learn and to train like nobody's business.
He did things that were unbelievable. 1-round knockout, 2-round knockouts, 3-round knockouts.
We had a whole bunch of Italian boys from Federal Hill. Marciano would throw the punch, and as he's going down, the boys from Federal Hill holler out, "Timber!"
I told him in the dressing room, "You're going to be champ someday." Because I never had seen a right hand like his, you know?
Rocky was the coolest cucumber in the dressing room. He'd go to sleep.
He had this great ability to take a nap no matter what was happening.
I used to say, how you going, Rock? Tired. I used to see fighters in the dressing room. Some would be reading the Bible, others would be walking up and down, nervous. How the hell he could sleep, I don't know.
Rocky Marciano took a clean shot at an average person's chin and hit him hard enough, he could decapitate him. That's the legend of Rocky Marciano, that he could take a man's head off with a single punch.
Despite knocking out 22 of his first 24 opponents, Marciano didn't recognize the extent of his powerful punch until he met undefeated 6'4" Carmine Vingo in December of 1949.
That was his first main event in Madison Square Garden. And Carmine Vingo was doing extremely well with him.
Vingo was giving and getting with Rocky on equal terms. And then in the 4th round, Rocky broke through, knocked Vingo down.
Vingo was finally counted out, and he was hurt badly. He was taken to the hospital. They were afraid he might be paralyzed.
He was unconscious for a while, and Rocky went to church and prayed for his recovery.
Marciano donated $2,500 to care for Vingo.
Rocky spent a great deal of time right at the hospital with Carmine.
He knew that Carmine would no longer be able to resume his boxing career.
Marciano didn't fight for 3 or 4 months. He wasn't going to fight. He was so upset about it. And Carmine Vingo's family convinced Marciano that he should fight.
With a retired Vingo in attendance, Marciano married Barbara Cousins on December 31st, 1950, and left on a honeymoon cut short by Al Weil, who reminded Marciano that boxing came before love.
Hold tight to your chairs now and be ready to duck, for this is punching in capital letters.
There was much more to Rocky Marciano than people knew about because he had his own technique, his own way of tearing you up in close.
Rocky's style, his awkwardness, largely worked for him in many fights. Fighters never knew where the punches were coming from, how low they were coming from, because Rocky dipped, how wide they were coming from, whether Rocky was going to lead or counter.
You look at the film of the way he knocked out Harry Kid Matthews, the way he feinted a right hand and then threw a double left hook.
And down goes Matthews.
It was a brilliant, tactical conclusion to a fight.
Matthews said, I felt good in the first round. He said the second round was all over. He says, my God, could he punch.
On October 26, 1951, Marciano was matched against an over-the-hill 37-year-old ex-champ he once idolized.
Brockton Arena had amateur boxing. Joe Louis was going to be the referee. We followed him around. Finally, he went to the men's room, and I boosted Rocky up so we could get a better look at him. When he come out, he spotted us. He threw us a $50 apiece.
Joe Louis himself had to talk Rocky into accepting the fight because at that time he was having tax trouble.
He needed this fight, and Rocky knew that. But Rocky needed this fight, too, for a stepping stone.
It seems part of heavyweight history that the mantle has to be passed. Al Weil saw that if Rocky could beat Louis, the public would buy Rocky as the next champion to be.
I remember looking up at Rocky and I said, Rocky, you're going to be fighting Joe Louis. How do you think you're going to be doing against him? And he cut me short and he said, don't you ever question my ability. I will beat Joe Louis and I will beat any fighter that I ever fight.
Marciano just did what he had to do with an old Joe Louis. He overwhelmed him, he wore him down. He didn't allow him the space to use his experience.
He knocked Joe Louis clear out of the ropes. And Joe is a helpless figure. He looks like one of those bums he used to knock out.
The working press try to help Joe back off the ring apron.
You can see Ray Robinson running down the aisle to try to hug Joe Louis to see if he was all right.
Afterwards, you know, you could almost feel all the kind of the power draining out of Marciano. There was almost the sense of him saying, I'm sorry, Joe.
It was a very, very tough moment for America. Not just Rocky Marciano, but this was the most beloved ring champion in history. It was one of those situations where he was probably despised for winning a fight.
His first real big paycheck came against Joe Louis, of all people. After that fight, Rocky went up to Dad and told him, you worked your last day in the shoe shop.
Marciano's father, Pierino, became a regular at training camp, where he ran afoul of Al Weil.
My dad was a great cook, in fact, and used to make some specialty things, lentil soup, and certain little things that Rocky enjoyed.
Al Weil went in the kitchen and yelled at my dad. He said, Pop, you know, we didn't hire you to be the chef. Rocky walked into the kitchen. He said, don't you ever talk to my dad like that again. Don't butt in.
This was not the first nor the last conflict between Marciano and his manager. Money and control were the real issues beneath their rancor.
Al Weil many a times would take an extra 100 tickets from the promoter and go out and sell them before the fight and pocket the money.
Weil was definitely getting 50% of all of Rocky's earnings.
When they went out of town, Al Weil would take the big suite, and before the press came in, Rocky would be called down and sit in the suite as if he were living there.
And if he didn't like something that Rocky had done or dead, Weil would haul off and slap him hard right across the face.
Marciano's fury was saved for the ring. After winning the title from Walcott on that surprise punch in the 13th round in 1952, Rocky removed any doubts of his legitimacy when he dispatched Jersey Joe in the first round of their rematch 8 months later.
At the height of his championship days, the U.S. testing company was contracted to test the power in Marciano's punch.
They have him punch into a machine, and they're testing the strength of his punches.
They later came out with a report that said the energy of Marciano's punch was equivalent to an armor-piercing shell.
Marciano's reputation as a savage puncher only grew in his 6 title defenses. Particularly gruesome was the beating he gave Roland Lastarza. After nearly losing to Lastarza in a split decision before he was champion, Marciano pounded him mercilessly in their 1953 rematch.
Lastarza was one of the more better-looking people, but after that fight, he wasn't as good-looking.
Rocky took the approach, I'm just going to hit him and hit him and hit him and break him down.
Rocky just chopped him up. He would hit Roland on the arms and break his blood vessels.
Marciano held him up in the 3rd round, held him up in the 6th round, held him up in the 8th round. He demolished him. And Marciano was sorry later. He said, gee, did I hurt him? I said, I guess you did.
With his 11th round TKO of Lastarza, Marciano earned his 45th victory. His record had been achieved without the intervention of Freddie Carbo, boxing's underground commissioner.
I interviewed Carbo, but he was in the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois at that time. And he said that nothing was ever done to influence any of Rocky's fights because Rocky didn't need it.
There was a standing order around the country to all mob families. Rocky stays clean. There's no hanky-panky. He doesn't throw a fight and lose the title so he can come back and win it again. He's the image of the Italian-American in America, and nobody mess with him or you're going to have to mess with me.
I think there's a lot of false mythology about Marciano that maybe sticks to him because he's an Italian-American. Marciano was a up-and-up guy who knew gangsters, but was not controlled by them the way Jake LaMotta was or other fighters.
They wanted to do a lot for Rocky just to be near him, and he accepted that. He loved to have 6 suits all made up for him and didn't have to pay for them.
Although these mafia and mob people loved Rocky, he didn't necessarily love them, but he loved that sense of danger that was around him. That in order to live a full, rich life, you had to live dangerously.
I remember standing with him, and after about 4 or 5 drinks, I used to look at him and I would think, this guy's got little short arms, a real high voice. If I gave him a quick shot, I could be champion of the world. And he looked over at me and went, don't even think about it.
As for this coming fight on the 15th, I'm sure glad to be meeting Ezra Charles again because I've always improved a little bit on the 2nd time around.
In their first meeting in 1954, Marciano retained his title in a unanimous 15-round decision. But a savvy Charles had Rocky on the ropes in the rematch 3 months later.
Charles had the classic style, the classic movement, and strong. He was a strong guy. Rocky had to outstrong the guy, outsmart the guy. He had a vicious fight with him.
He was as close as he ever came, closer than he ever came to losing in that fight.
Charles had hit him with an uppercut and cut the nose. It was a rare type of a cut because it went up his nose.
Marciano's nose has been split into 2 ribbons of flesh, and his handlers have covered it with a Pinocchio-like bandage.
It looked like someone had taken scissors, and there's this big gaping hole, and the blood is pouring down. And when Rocky came back to the corner, everyone was sure the fight would be stopped.
They said, Rocky, you're going to lose this fight if you don't knock him out. The referee is watching the cut very badly, got a bad cut, and that put an additional fire under him.
His face looked like it was a bleeding piece of meat, but he soldiered on.
Rocky said, please, give me one more chance. It's not bothering me at all.
For whatever reason, the doctor gave Rocky one more round, probably because he was the defending heavyweight champion.
Marciano knocked him out in the 8th round, retained his championship. He said the first thing he did, he ran downstairs to the locker room, opened the door, went to a mirror, and he said he almost fainted.
get sick. I mean, I saw his nose, and when I tell you that it was just literally split, you could actually lift it up like that.
Of course, Rocky said it will heal and there'll be no problem. He took everything lightly.
It was one of those defining moments when you look at your big brother and you say, he's invincible.
The head falling apart, the arms coming off, he just would not stop. This is what the word champion is. This is Rocky Marciano.
Do you feel, Archie, that you can knock Marciano out? Of course, he never has. Well, that's always the first time.
In 1955, light heavyweight champion Archie Moore embarked on a publicity campaign to entice Marciano into a title match.
He put out wanted posters with Marciano's picture on it.
Marciano would be on the golf course. He would get a note, "Are you afraid of an old man?" He got under his skin, and he finally agreed to give Moore the fight.
15 rounds for the heavyweight championship of the world.
Moore hit him a straight right hand, enough to knock him down. He was a little stunned for a second.
I was outboxed easily, and he came around with some awful bone-cutting jolts.
It was a hard, grueling fight, and finally Rocky knocked out Archie in the 9th round.
Seven months later, Marciano came to a life-altering decision. On April 27, 1956, he sent shockwaves through the fight world. He retired at 49-0. He was 32.
I promised my wife that I would retire before the month of May arrived. Didn't ever really get hurt in the ring, and I feel perfect physically, and probably still had 2 or 3 good fights left.
He was tired of the training, he was undefeated, and there was really nobody out there to fight.
He thought he'd done enough fighting. His back, of course, was very bad, and the grueling grind that he forced on himself of training, he'd lost some of his zest for that.
He was angry that Al Weil was taking such a large cut of his purses. He didn't like Al Weil.
Rocky told me, even when I retire, I must give him in excess of 50% of any income that I derive. He said, I'll be damned if I'm going to give Al Weil any more money.
You know, once a boxer retires, they don't have that much left. They haven't gone to college. They don't have anything to fall back on, really. So he knew he had to hold on to his money, and when he sets a goal, he pursues it.
A lot of money and ended up in Skid Row. I think one of Rocky's greatest fears in life was that he didn't want this to happen to him.
Preserving his cash was one way of his knowing that he would never get back into that position that his family was when he was a younger boy.
Rocky Marciano lived what is possibly one of the most bizarre lives following his career as anybody I've ever looked at in sports.
He was running around the country all the time, trying to get his money.
He'd be in one state, and then he'd go to Chicago, and he'd bum a ride here, and he'd bum a ride there.
Rocky earned a lot of his money by loaning people throughout the United States money and charging them interest.
Then if you didn't pay it back, that really irritated him.
If they owed him $5,000, it had to be in cash, no checks. $10,000, $20,000, and he'd put them in paper bags, and he'd always give his mother one of the bags. So Rocky'd say, it's just, you're spending money, Ma.
Besides loan sharking, Marciano invested in a number of businesses.
He bought several restaurants. He got into the tomato business, into the potato business.
Like the tomatoes made him money. Couldn't even can them, nothing to can.
He just didn't want to know anything about the business end of it. He felt if he got into a deal that it was a handshake, and if they reneged on this handshake, he would have his own way of taking care of it.
If he wasn't lending cash, he was stashing it.
He'd stuff his cash under his mattresses, hide it in toilet bowls, refrigerators.
He hid money in pipes, in wall outlets.
He had some kind of primitive immigrant attitude that you don't trust banks, you keep your money cash.
He just liked the feel and the look of cash.
He was offered a $5,000 check once up in Montreal for giving a speech after dinner, and he told the man at the dinner party, he says, "I'm sorry, I don't take checks, I want cash."
And the guy said, "There's no way I can do it." So Rocky called him back. He said, "Look, you've got to do this. I'm leaving tonight, and I'll take half."
The chairman of the dinner had to go all around the room, black tie dinner, and collect cash from the people. And he gave him $2,500, and Rocky gave him the check and said, "Thank you."
He loved the money, and he didn't spend too much of it. He had what I always said to him all the time: you have long pockets, short hands.
Although frugal to a fault, Marciano would dig deep if he believed in a cause.
Are you crazy? No, wait, no!
There was many times when he would get $5,000, $2,500, $3,500 for guest appearance, for speaking. And if he knew a fighter was down and out, he'd call him up. He'd say, "Listen, I got a spot for you." And then he would tell the other party, I'm saying, "Look, I can't make it. I have a double date, but I'll come back for nothing. But give Joe Walcott the spot, give Ezra Charles the spot."
Ezra Charles got a terrible disease late in his life, and Rocky threw a tremendously big fundraiser for him. Felt very proud of what he was able to do for Ezra Charles.
If he liked you, he'd stand in your store all day long. He'd lend his name to you. If you were his friend, he'd try to help you out.
Judge, I asked a couple of fellows that said they knew you, and they told me that you knew absolutely nothing about boxing. How
Yes,
come
but
on
last
you know it?
night I met a man, and he said that with boxing you can make a fortune. If I would make you, if I would take you into fight again, we could all make $1 million.
After refusing lucrative offers to fight Floyd Patterson and Sonny Liston, Marciano accepted $10,000 for a 1969 bout in Miami Beach that was billed as the heavyweight fight of the century.
Both men undefeated. Ali 29 out of 29 and Rocky 49 out of 49.
Well, I'm glad that we've got a computer being the man that makes the decision. I've never predicted a fight in my life. I've never knocked anybody before a fight, and I'm certainly not going to start now.
Any fighter, if he's in arm reach of me, he's hit. He's cut, he's bleeding, his face is puffed up, he can't think, his brains are shook up.
Their styles were so different and their personalities were North Pole and South Pole. You know, you had one guy who loved to talk and another guy who probably stayed away from talking.
I told Rocky, look, it's showbiz. We're hustling, we're talking. He talks too much. Rocky didn't like the guy, and I couldn't talk him out of it.
Rocky was from the old school. He was from another era. And to be brash during his era was something that people frowned upon.
During the filming of the fight, they were following the computer's instructions. Ali was complaining that Rocky was really hurting him in the forearms with these punches.
Muhammad had been off. Rocky had been off forever, but he did a great job. And Rocky came to me and said, "Angie is a nice kid."
A left by the Rock, and Clay is down. Here's the count. 3, 4, 5, 6.
Well, they had 4 or 5 different endings. The ending that they chose was Marciano knocking out Ali. And when I pointed that out to him, he said, "Oh, he's great, there's no doubt about it." And then he smiled and he says, "But you know, in my prime, I'd have killed him."
Loved to be in different places. It didn't matter where it was. When he landed somewhere, he always had somebody to pick him up because he didn't want to spend the money on cab fare.
When we return, Marciano's fast-paced lifestyle catches up with him in the middle rounds.
He'd leave, and with 5 minutes' notice, he'd say, "So long, Barbara," and off he would go. He couldn't stop moving.
I don't think they had a very good relationship because he was gone all the time.
Rocky wanted to play. He wanted to go out and play. And he had a prodigious sexual appetite that he indulged in for many years after he left the ring.
He did like women quite a bit, and whenever he got some favors done to him while we were on the road, he'd accept them graciously.
If he weren't a womanizer, he'd certainly be alone among legendary heavyweight champions.
I have my doubts as to exactly what what he was looking and searching for. I don't honestly know what it was that drove him.
He liked danger and courage. Those were two things that were very important to him.
One day we were driving, and I said, Rocky, you went past the stop. And he says, oh, okay. So he whips the car around. It was on a 4-lane highway, and goes back through the oncoming traffic, weaving in and out. And naturally, I've got my head down between my legs, and I'm dying.
There were times when I think he thought that he was infallible. He was in a couple of near plane crashes, and it just didn't faze him.
In late August of 1969, Marciano agreed to do a last-minute favor for a friend.
His original plans were to be home with his family for his birthday. Last minute, a friend of his asked him to travel to Des Moines, Iowa.
There was a fundraiser for like a youth program in that Iowa area. And he said to me, I got to make one stop first, in Drake Hotel. He said, kid, could you drive me? So I drove him over there, and that was the last I heard of Rocky Marciano.
He would fly in any kind of weather. He absolutely disdained any danger of any form. He had that feeling of invincibility. He thought he was bulletproof, that nothing could hurt him.
And he went up with a guy with a few hours flying time. They hit a rainstorm over West Newton, Iowa. They crashed into the trees. He was decapitated.
And I heard it on the radio, a bulletin, that Rocky Marciano was killed. It was just kind of eerie.
Oh, God. That's all I could say over and over. I immediately called my mother, who had a couple members of the family with her. She was screaming over the phone, "Figlio me, my son, my beautiful son."
When I called home, my dad answered. There was a long pause, and finally I said, Daddy, you all right? And he said, Peter, my God, he said, I thought I was getting a call from heaven.
A few days after the residents of Brockton mourned their favorite son, Marciano was buried near his Fort Lauderdale home.
Joe Louis kissed the top of the casket, looked at the ceiling of the funeral home, and said, God is getting himself a beautiful man.
I met with Rocky, a week or so before, and I never saw him so happy. And he looked at me and he said, Sonny, I finally feel good about the things that are happening. I've got several things that are going to earn me a lot of money. I won't ever have to worry again.
In death, the question of whether Marciano hid the bulk of his money quickly evolved into a certainty among some friends and relatives.
I think when Rocky died, a lot of people still owed him a lot of money. Plus the rest of it he buried down in Florida.
People thought he put it in Bernie Castro's bomb shelter down in Florida. But Bernie denied that after Rocky died, you know. So nobody knows where Rocky's money is.
We're not still searching for it. We've given up on that idea. I don't believe we ever really looked that hard for it.
As to Marciano's true worth as a fighter, there will always be conflicting opinions.
Marciano's the only fighter that's probably overrated and underrated at the same time. You know, some people overrate him because he was undefeated, and other guys will underrate him because he fought a lot of these great fighters at a later time in their life.
One of the most important ways to measure a fighter's worth is how he came back from a defeat. Marciano didn't have that. Being perfect, he never had a chance to avenge a defeat. With him, it was what he did during his fights. He was behind against Charles. He was behind against Walcott. He came back to beat these guys.
He was an engine. He was a person who devoted his life to his dream, to his cause.
Typified the many great Italian boxers of his day, the sons of immigrants who only knew how to march ahead in a straight line to get to where they were going.
I see his legacy as a fighter as a man of indomitable courage. Rocky Marciano showed what the will to win can
Why did Marciano not leave a will? Was the certainty of his own death too disturbing? Or, more likely, was he too busy living? Rocky proved his invincibility time and again. After clearing obstacles that stymie lesser men, he came to dominate a sport that compresses the essence of life to its purest form. As columnist Red Smith wrote of Rocky Marciano, fear wasn't in his vocabulary, and pain had no meaning. For ESPN Classic Sports Century, I'm Chris Fowler.